Hello, everyone. I'm here with Judge Hartz, who is also running for overseer to get onto the ballot for overseer. And we've been talking a bunch over the last few weeks about the campaign and principles and kind of Harvard. And so I'm really excited to have an opportunity to speak to him live on Zoom and talk a little bit about the issues. So with that, Judge Hartz, thank you for joining. And do you want to just talk a little bit about kind of what inspired you to spend some time, working on this problem and the overseers and things like that?
It's been a real learning experience. The learning curve has been very steep, but it starts because of my affection for Harvard when I was a student there. It's been a long time. I just love the college. I love the law school. And part of it was, no one was worried about speaking his or her mind back then that I can recall. I certainly didn't worry about it, and I knew I didn't have views that were shared by the majority. But everyone wanted to listen and talk. Professors were great that way. And what I see at the university these days is just very disturbing.
Yeah.
Because it shows an intolerance for thought. And I think this follows almost automatically from that absolute ignorance.
Yeah.
And it's very disturbing. There's the hate. But behind that is the ignorance and intolerance.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel similarly. I mean, to me, I don't know if this resonates or you agree with this, but it almost feels to me like the school has it exactly backwards at this point, where in the classroom, in the context of academic discussions and learning, there isn't free speech. I mean, I've spoken to so many people in this process of this, administrators, professors, students who feel really like they don't have a free forum to express ideas and explore things in the classroom civilly. But then outside the classroom, a huge amount of disruption to the academic process is tolerated. And so to me, it seems like kind of wild that we're in this point where it's inverted from what I would hope and expect, and kind of what I experienced at school, right? Which was there was, I was there, I graduated in 2005. There was a lot of different viewpoints expressed in civil discourse with a wide range of issues in the classroom. But maybe there was less protesting outside the classroom.
Well, and the protesting didn't affect the educational system.
Yeah, I think that's the key part.
The big protest when I was in school was students, some of whom are friends of mine, taking over the administrative building, sitting in there. But I never recall disruption of classes. Maybe my memory is faded in that regard, but that just wasn't an issue.
Yeah.
And what I had observed over the years is I go to reunions because I have some people I really love who were classmates. And I've noticed the narrowness of the point of view, the one-sidedness of the presentations then. And that's been disturbing. And it never occurred to me that that had any connection with the governance of the university.
Yeah.
But it's my concern really is the power of the Alumni Association. And if they want to organize the reunions with one-sided presentations, that's one thing. But when they also control, in so many ways, the election of overseers and the governance of the university, that's a totally different issue. And I had not made that connection and didn't appreciate the power until I talked to you and Harvey Silverglade and found out the system for getting on the ballot.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. The thing I've learned in this process and been kind of shocked by it, I'd say, is twofold. One is when I started this process, the story many people said to me is, Sam, this is not worth your time because the corporation is where all the power is and the overseers really have no power. It's just ceremonial. So why bother? Like, you have other better things to spend your time on. And that was the initial response I got. And then I dug a little deeper. And I think what's really happened is technically and formally, the overseers do have some really important roles to play, co-signing decisions by the corporation on things like who's the next president and corporate appointments and having the seat at the table to ask really important questions. But what's happened, to your point about the Alumni Association and HAAs, and I'm not sure this is a specific person's fault versus just drift, is that it became this thing which was used as a carrot for people to do things with HAA, where they basically said, if you are super involved, right, and you run clubs and then we'll eventually put you up for overseer. And it became this carrot they used that way, which created this dual problem. Like, one is it kind of disempowered the seriousness of the mission and like their value as a board from an overseer perspective. And two, to your point, there ended up being this weird capture situation where what you see being put forth is not necessarily people who want to invest and care about the governance of the university and making sure we have free speech and the right type of speech in classrooms and promoting academics first, but instead kind of loyalists who would just kind of go along with whatever the kind of the winds were at the time. And I think that's really a dangerous position for a governance organization to be in. Is that kind of your...
Well, I don't know nearly as much as you do about that process. I thought it as more of a protest. And if dissidents like you and Harvey, me and there are 4 others, got a lot of votes, hopefully got elected to the overseer, then that would send a signal.
Yeah.
Because the smugness of the powers that be is a real problem. They think everything is great.
Well, and it's interesting because, again, I think the representation is a real problem because, in an overseer's election, you generally get about 30,000 voters out of a population of 300,000 alums, right?
Okay.
And, I think that what that ends up being is you have this group that, because of who's voting, it's such a small percentage of the alumni base that in some ways, like HAA and I'd say Harvard isn't hearing the voice, right, of the alumni more broadly, all of whom have a stake and care a lot about the university, right? It becomes this thing where it feels very confrontational rather than trying to be collaborative, right? Because they don't want to, they kind of have their system as they have it set.
Well, this is really connected with my career too, because my greatest interest as a judge has been in procedural issues. It's great because my colleagues often aren't that interested in it, so I get to write opinions in the area. But I'm very interested in how things are done rather than the substantive result. Mm-hmm. And that's what disturbs me so much here. And yet when you look at it, it's absolutely natural that this is what would happen. Who's going to go to Alumni Association meetings? People who are really happy with things. What does Harvard want to send? What sort of people does Harvard want to send to speak to them? Those who are rah-rah about the organization. There's nothing wrong with that. Alumni associations are great. Their connection to governance is insidious.
Yeah, I agree. And it's interesting because I feel like this is the thing I feel like we're seeing a lot right now across all of society, which is governance failures, for a whole bunch of reasons. And I think you see that, I don't know as much about the political arena, but in the business arena where I am, FTX was a huge governance failure, in terms of how that played out. A lot of these scandals like SVB, Theranos, like a lot of the big scandals we've seen, really when you break them down, even most recently OpenAI, I don't know if you follow this, but like what's going on in the AI world and the difference between a nonprofit board.
It's beyond my ken.
Well, I think that the idea of, you had a board with a mandate, and then a for-profit reporting that board with a different mandate and kind of the tensions and the breakdown between those interests, right? I think this is the interesting thing. And I think in the case of Harvard, it seems like it's coming to a head for 2 reasons. One is strictly who's involved in the governance and how much they're taking it seriously and versus it's kind of a carrot and they're kind of going along with the flow and who's going to push back and make sure that you have the right people in power. But the second is also, and I'm curious your take on this, how boards and groups redefine mission. So if you think about it, I would argue that for 400 years, Harvard's mission has been academics first. It's been academic excellence, right? And everything serves that. Like the reason you care about free speech in a classroom setting is for the sake of academic excellence, right? The reasons you care about diversity of opinions is to drive academic excellence, but that has been the true north. And it seems like recently Harvard is kind of, without necessarily buy-in or, a real process or governance, kind of slid into this direction of considering itself a double bottom line or a triple bottom line organization that's not only interested in academic excellence, but also in other things, right? And to me, that's another real governance question is who gets to evolve a mission, if that makes sense, and like how much are people held accountable to that final mission?
There really shouldn't be any mission beyond excellence. And that is not inconsistent with diversity. There are plenty of people of all views and all backgrounds who are who've reached the highest levels of excellence. Um, but excellence requires debate.
Yes.
One thing I mentioned to you that kind of epitomized what's going on. After the Supreme Court decision, I'm a law school graduate as well as a college graduate of Harvard. After the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action at Harvard, I got an email that there was going to be a session that alums could watch with faculty at Harvard Law School discussing the decision. And I thought, I'll learn something from this. This is great. And you have four very intelligent, very articulate people, all disparaged, condemned the decision. Where they differed was in how you can limit the effect of the decision. That's terrible.
Yeah.
You don't learn as much, and they don't learn as much.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example from the conservative side.
Yeah.
I have always enjoyed, particularly when I lived in Washington for a couple of years, going to Federalist Society meetings because they always had not just opposing views, but very good ones.
Yeah.
I think the most common guest member of a panel when I was in DC was Nadine Struck. Her name just escapes me. She's the head of the ACLU, national head.
Yeah.
And she was great. And you couldn't get away with saying stupid things with her president.
Yeah.
And as a result, they've honed their arguments. It's not a political organization, contrary to what some people think, but you get your thoughts challenged and you get better and better at making arguments. Then you have people like Justice Kagan saying we are now all originalists. That couldn't have been said 20 years ago.
Yeah.
But it's because maybe I've gone too far on that.
No, I think this is a great example. I mean,
but that's what we need.
Yeah. 100%.
And I love that at Harvard.
Yeah.
Can I give one example of something that could never happen at Harvard now, and happened my freshman year, and it was one of the most important experiences in my life. When I was a freshman, the Harvard Democrats voted by a narrow margin to invite George Wallace, governor of Alabama, to speak.
Yes.
He was the epitome of evil. There wasn't a worse person in this country at the time. I went to his talk in Sanders Theater, and it astonished me. He was a bright, charming, witty person, and evil. And you realize that that's not how you judge people. You don't judge how their policies based on their personality.
Yeah.
And that was a big. I know that sounds maybe it's totally obvious to everyone. It was very important moment for me.
Well, for what it's worth,
he was not shouted down. He was allowed to speak. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting to me because to me, you talk about is this obvious or not? I mean, one of the things that really scares me about where Harvard is, and I think as Harvard as kind of a beacon and reflection about our society right now, is this question about are we evaluating people, ideas on the strength of the idea versus who's saying it, right? And I think that unfortunately, we've slipped into this thing in this very unfortunate place where all of a sudden it matters who's speaking and not the substance of the argument, right? And I think that is extremely illiberal, right, and extremely anti-diversity in a lot of ways, and ends up being is a real problem if we think about kind of the future we want, right, and having the best ideas and academic excellence and excellence in general on the table, right? Well,
I'll
be honest, it's confusing to me how we got here because it seems deeply contrary to I think the direction of and the kind of core liberal values of caring about ideas and not being so focused on who says what. Well,
and it's not just core liberal values, core Harvard values, as I
absolutely yes, 100%.
So it's not just that I've made some of these comments, and one classmate I'm very close to sent me an email today saying, well, I'm sure these things are problems with all universities. They probably are, or almost all. Harvard should be the leader.
100%.
Harvard should be the one that's the best and the model for everyone.
I think not only should it be, but I think even if it didn't want to be, it has to be. Because it is, I think, the reality is, part of the reason I'm so passionate about this, I do care about Harvard. I loved Harvard. It's a very important institution. I met my wife there. I made friends there. It pushed me, all those wonderful things. But even setting those things aside, the reason I care about this so much is that Harvard is the best known academic brand in the world. And the standards it sets do have implications for everywhere else, what people think of liberal education, how how other schools shape their behaviors. And so the fact that Harvard is so far behind the curve and messing this up, I think is not just a problem for Harvard. I think it's a problem more broadly for our country and the world, and I care about that. I think Harvard not only should be setting an example, but even if it didn't want to be setting the example, has a responsibility to.
I agree with you 100%. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, Judge Hartz, is there anything else? I mean, you and I have both been talking for a while. It's been one of the pleasures of this, has been getting to know some great people like you and kind of working on this. Is there anything else, just, before we send this out to some folks, that you think we should get across or talk about in terms of what's going on right now and kind of how to help make progress?
There probably is. We limit each side in oral argument to 15 minutes. That's about as much as anyone's going to listen.
That's true.
We've probably done what we can today.
I think that's the similarity between, it turns out, federal court and the internet, is there's about a 15-minute attention span.
It's really been great, and it's been encouraging to me, not just to meet people like you and Harvey, but in communicating with some old timers and telling them what's going on, and finding that even if our politics are very different, they have these very significant concerns. And 2 hours ago, I was talking to my favorite law school professor. He's not at Harvard now. And he couldn't believe, I mean, he's an expert on corporate governance. It had never occurred to him that the Alumni Association controls a lot of governance mechanism at Harvard. It's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't blame any one person, but the evolution is clearly not what needs to. No, it's more these things evolve. Big organizations end up in weird places, and sometimes you need people to reset them back to their, in this case, 1650 roots.
It's really important that this be an institutional thing, a governance thing, not a personal thing.
Absolutely.
I suspect the members of the board I know one member of the board of overseers, and she's one of my favorite people, and I have tremendous respect for her. I sent her an email a month ago asking about this and didn't get a response. Maybe I had the wrong address, but this should not be considered a personal.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Excellent. Well, Judge Hartz, thanks again for doing this. I'll distribute it out to some folks, and I think it'll be a nice thing for people to see and hear from you about these issues. So I appreciate you, and thanks for doing it.
I appreciate you. Thanks so much, Sam.
All right. Thank you. Let me just stop.